Welcome to Flippening, the first and original podcast for full-time, professional, and institutional crypto investors. I'm your host, Clay Collins. Each week we discuss the cryptocurrency economy, new investment strategies for maximizing returns, and stories from the front lines of financial disruption. Go to flippening.com to join our newsletter for cryptocurrency investors and find out just why this podcast is called Flippening.
Clay Collins is the CEO of Nomics. All opinions expressed by Clay and podcast guests are solely their own opinion and do not reflect the opinion of Nomics or any other company. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and should not be relied upon as the basis for investment decisions.
Welcome to this conversation with Pete Rizzo, editor-at-large at Kraken, which is a top 10 crypto exchange and one of the first legitimate crypto businesses in the space. Before Kraken, Pete was editor-in-chief at CoinDesk, where he worked for 6 years and helped grow the publication from a concept to the industry's most important crypto news website. This interview is ostensibly about Kraken Intelligence's fascinating report entitled Inheriting USDs and Acquiring BTCs, how the great wealth transfer will fuel the great Bitcoin adoption. But we also spent a great deal of time discussing the history of crypto journalism, the origins of CoinDesk, his editor-in-chief role, crypto journalism today, and Pete's new role at Kraken. As a side note, if you want to hear more about the state of crypto journalism, check out episode 70 of this podcast, where we speak with Mike Dudas, CEO of The Block, about their growth from 0 to 4 million readers in 18 months. Our conversation is split into 4 chapters. Chapter 1 is about Pete's time at CoinDesk. In Chapter 2, we discuss Pete's current role as editor-at-large at Kraken. In Chapter 3, we do a deep dive on the Kraken report. Finally, in Chapter 4, we consider the cryptocurrency canon or collection of writings that anyone interested in crypto assets and blockchain should read. The transcript and show notes for this episode are available at flippening.com/Rizzo. That's spelled R-I-Z-Z-O. We'll get to this episode in just a second, but before we get started, I'd like to pause for a moment to tell you that this episode is brought to you by the good folks at Nexo.io. Here's a word from them. Nexo is the only lender offering instant crypto credit lines, which let you use digital assets as collateral to get cash in 45 fiat currencies and stable coins. You might remember Nexo from episode 64, where we spoke with their co-founder, Anthony Trenchev. If you haven't heard that episode, I highly recommend checking it out, as it's one of our most popular episodes to date. And Nexo has a big announcement related to credit lines. Their annual interest rates for credit lines are now starting at just 5.9%, which may very well be the lowest borrowing rate in the whole industry. Nexo is also a strategic partner of exchanges, OTC desks, and crypto funds through its portfolio of structured financial products. Institutional counterparties can earn up to 8% annually on their idle stablecoins, enter into asset swap agreements, or directly borrow crypto. Individuals can also park their cash and stablecoins at Nexo's interest-earning account to get an annual return of 8%. What's more, interest is paid out daily, and you can add or withdraw funds at any time. So if you're looking to borrow, lend, or swap digital assets, Nexo is your go-to partner. Definitely explore Nexo.io, or if you're an institution, reach out to them at institutions@nexo.io. This episode is also brought to you by the good folks at CryptoTrader.tax. Here are 4 things you should know about them. Number 1, CryptoTrader.tax automates the entire crypto tax reporting process and has partnered with the TurboTax team to bring cryptocurrency tax reporting to the mainstream. Number 2, CryptoTrader.tax offers a complete tax loss harvesting module to help investors figure out their greatest tax savings opportunities to reduce their taxable income. Number 3, CryptoTrader.tax supports all fiat currencies, meaning users from all over the world can use the platform to calculate their gains and losses in their home fiat currency. Finally, number 4, CryptoTrader.tax offers a suite for tax professionals to help them manage their cryptocurrency clients. While I'm not a CPA and not qualified to provide tax advice, I should note that I personally advise my family to never just hand over their exchange history to a CPA. Instead, I encourage them to let CryptoTrader.tax analyze their trade histories, find the tax calculation method that's best optimized to save them money, and then submit summary documents to their accountant. This also saves you from having to pay your accountant to do the tedious work of generating Form 8949 and other similar forms. Creating an account and importing your historical data is completely free. You only pay when you want to download your tax report for the year. Just tell them that Clay from the Flippening podcast sent you. This does 2 things for you. First of all, it gets you a discount. And second, it lets CryptoTrader.tax know that these ads are working. So go to CryptoTrader.tax now and sign up today. Finally, this episode is brought to you by the Nomics API and CSV data export service. If you need an enterprise-grade crypto market data API for your fund, smart contract, or app, Or if you need historical CSV dumps of trading data or crypto market cap data from top exchanges or even obscure ones, then consider trying out the Nomics API or our historical data export service. Just go to nomicsapi.com to learn more or email us at sales@nomics.com. Okay, back to our regularly scheduled program. Here's my conversation with Pete Rizzo, editor-at-large at Kraken. Enjoy. Before we get started, I was thinking about this interview and how it should kind of come together. And it occurred to me that it would be a huge missed opportunity if we, before talking about this really interesting report, if we didn't talk a little bit about your background and some of the wisdom that you've accumulated in the crypto journalism trenches. You're really one of the pioneers in the space. Can you tell us a little bit about what you were up to before crypto and how you discovered this whole space?
Sure. Well, before I was a professional journalist, I was an aspiring journalist. And as an aspiring journalist, I was looking for ways to get my name out there, cover something that was interesting. Obviously, when you're young and trying to get started in any field, it's difficult to really differentiate yourself. I ended up working for a friend of mine who was doing mobile payments journalism around kind of the emerging fintech space. I got involved there. Started taking on some articles and eventually figured I needed to differentiate myself. So this was at the top of 2013. And as many listeners might know, this was the early days of Mt. Gox was losing its banking relationships. There was kind of the first venture capital was really funding Bitcoin and cryptocurrency companies, or really just Bitcoin companies then. So I really, sank my teeth into those stories. I attended some local Bitcoin meetups in Boston, got to know the people, and I was just super fascinated by all the stories there. I think my first article had something like I interviewed a comedian who had invested in Bitcoin, a business owner was accepting Bitcoin, just a wide variety of like very interesting people and characters. And I think that's what really drew me to cryptocurrency, is it was something that was really new. No one could really quite explain it. And it was just a great story. And I found myself always fascinated by it, right? I think as someone who was like a writer, someone who was interested in, exploring concepts, you always want to be working on something where, there's no past precedent, right? You can't really go back to like 1900s and find an old article on cryptocurrency about somebody having already written that, right? You don't have this body of work that exists. Whereas if you're writing about politics or something, there's sort of this established canon that you need to live up to. And what I really liked about cryptocurrency was that it was just so new, right? You'd ask 10 people about it and you would get 11 answers, right? So, and I think it's still in many ways like that today.
I think that's a really great point. I think when it comes to content, it seemed like in crypto, there was a number of land grabs going on, but one of them was a branding, both personal branding and, branding when it comes to creating media businesses, content businesses, YouTube channels. There was this heyday that existed when, simply by existing and, putting out content on a fairly regular basis, it doesn't mean you'd necessarily make a lot of money, but you could establish yourself as one of the authorities in the space fairly early without much of a track record. And it sounds like you're speaking to some of that. Does that ring true to you?
There's a great quote from Paul Vigna who says, this is from The Age of Cryptocurrency, I think, where it's no one writes songs about PayPal. I always really liked that quote because I thought it summed up what I always found really interesting about cryptocurrency, which is they just had a passionate enthusiast base. Yeah, I think it was easy. There was a time when the barrier to entry to things was lower. I don't think that means necessarily that the first generation of pioneers did a bad job, right? I think you can look and see that a lot of the institutions that were built up early on have endured, some of them more successfully than others. But yeah, I do think overall, if you look at the ecosystem today for journalism, exchanges, compared to even 4 years ago, right? A good benchmark that people are using right now is where were we at the last halving, right? So that was in 2016 and the price was below $600. I think we were coming off a low of $200, $300. And I think the interesting thing to remember back then is that, we didn't really have the body of evidence that we had about Bitcoin's price and its historical behavior, right? I think that's one of the things that was so cool about this Kraken report that we'll get to talk about, right? Is that it dives into that. But, we didn't really have that stuff. So nobody knew that Bitcoin wasn't failing back then, right? And that's sort of where you get into the great lore of the community with, the infighting and the technology wars that occurred. But yeah, I do think it's a fascinating time. And you compare that to now, right? And there's still a lot of investment in cryptocurrency, even though it's a down market, as you alluded to. A lot of media brands out there, a lot of bloggers, people doing successful cryptocurrency content. And I think that's great, right? The support and the investment in the ecosystem is just so much higher than it was 4 years ago. And I think it's really, if you weren't there, it's hard to keep that in mind, right? I mean, you have exchanges like Kraken where, we have 800 employees, we have 70 open job positions, right? We're doing $83 million in daily volume, across our exchanges. And this is a down period for cryptocurrency, right? And I think, if you look at the last down market, that wasn't true, right? So, the overall health of the ecosystem, and again, that's something I think the report looks at really well. It's that, the Bitcoin ecosystem and the larger cryptocurrency ecosystem are pretty healthy compared to where they were, 4 years ago.
So let's a little bit about what you got into the space. I think the key word there is differentiation. It was a time when someone could differentiate by focusing on cryptos. It sounded like it was a good combination of following your passion, but also sounded like it was a great calculation in terms of career positioning as well.
I always thought that something like CoinDesk needed to exist, right? Even before I was a member of the CoinDesk team, right? I think it's easy to see why people would need quality information about a subject like cryptocurrency. And I think, even 10 years on, we're still struggling to make the technology, we're struggling to explain the technology people. I mentioned this recently to someone. I think one of the amazing things about real innovations in technology is that they almost, linguistics fails Bitcoin in a lot of respects, right? It is a technology that is so multifaceted, that is so dense in what it achieves, that we lack the ability to express what it does. And, that's really powerful, right? I think that has held back Bitcoin to some extent, right? But it's also representative of something larger, which is as humanity, we're confronting this new idea. And, we need to understand it in real time together, right? There's no way for us to accelerate our understanding of it. I think that's what's so cool about it. It does, in a lot of respects, still feel like a misunderstood thing, right? And I think, as someone who identified with being a journalist, I think it's you always want to take the side of advocating for the misunderstood. And I think Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies are still widely misunderstood.
With that, let's transition to chapter 1, which is about Pete's time at CoinDesk. How did you come in contact with that team, and what was your first role there, and how did that develop over time?
So I joined CoinDesk when it was a loose group of people on Skype, I think is probably the best way to refer to it, who just, had a really good idea for a product and were really nailing creating something really special for that market. So I joined around mid-2013. I was the first U.S. hire to a team that was largely based in Europe, and I quickly, became sort of the person they built around as they moved operations into the U.S. because that's, where a lot of the investment and the activity was happening. Obviously, that business changed over the years. Eventually got acquired. We launched a conference business. I think a lot of learning lessons there. Myself, I wore a lot of hats. I was someone who initially was writing stories. People may remember me, and a lot of people remember me in the spaces, the person who would take their phone call, at any time, if they had an announcement or something, right? I remember doing like a midnight call with somebody from Ripple, about their funding announcement, right? Because that was what we were trying to do with CoinDesk is always outcompete, sort of the major news sources and really build something where we were serving a 24-hour global market. And again, providing quality information, because I think the thing that the ecosystem really lacked back in the day was, and it still persists to today, it's that, a lot of the data services are bad. They rely on poor assumptions. They deliver information that's somewhat questionable. The same thing with, the startups and companies and announcements. Somebody needs to hold these people accountable, or at least, make transparent what is happening. I think that, I was always attracted to the mission of trying to grow that part of the ecosystem, because I felt that, again, that consumer protection and limiting harm are just, really attractive first principles, especially in an ecosystem like crypto, where those were really in short supply back in the day.
And then sort of as your role expanded and you became editor-in-chief, could you share a little bit about what an editor-in-chief does? Is it primarily focused on content, or Do you have revenue responsibilities? Are there sort of quantitative numbers or sort of goals that one needs to hit and is incentivized around? What does that look like? What are the incentives and sort of forces at play being in a role like that?
I would say that more than at any other company, journalists at CoinDesk were people who did mostly everything. I mean, I worked on helping launch the Consensus conference. I worked on the business side. I mean, you're talking for, the first 2 or 3 years, we expanded to about 12 people, but we contracted to 2 or 3 people. It was an environment where you had to wear a lot of hats, right? And media businesses are hard to monetize anyway. Doesn't matter really if you're in a new emerging technology field. That doesn't give you any special edge, right? It's still difficult to monetize. So yeah, I would say, in contrast to today, where I think a lot of young journalists are able to come into cryptocurrency and they're able to go to CoinDesk or the block or Decrypt, and they're able to, kind of focus on their stories. They're able to focus on their narratives. I think, really what the ecosystem lacked back in the day was, anything that would support them, right? So I think with CoinDesk was really the first successful company because it became a company, right? It became something that could support the kind of work that it wanted to further in the world, right? And I think there were a lot of early first generation Bitcoin media startups like Inside Bitcoin, News BTC, things that kind of came and went. But I always looked at it as the success of CoinDesk was supporting the work. It's the idea that something like this should exist and then committing to that continuance. And I think ultimately, we were able to get there. But I think it was so I don't know how to quantify editor-in-chief, right? I mean, I designed the interior of the office. I picked out the couch. I was up at 12 in the morning talking to our editor in China because we were establishing a 24-hour news outlet, right? So, all of a sudden we went to 24 hours and people were online all the day. I was determining how they had conversations in Slack and, who reported to who and what the role definitions were. So, I mean, I think, it really transitioned again from like a few people on Skype to something where it was a 40 plus person operation around the world. I mean, I think you'll hear similar stories like, even at Kraken now, right? It's an 800 person company around the world. They take security, 24-hour security very seriously. And you'll hear war stories from people there who, with the exchange when it was very small. Now, obviously, a number of departments and a number of verticals. I think everybody sort of has that same story, right? Especially in 2017 and dealing with the, influx of customers, the new demands on the products. That's been what's so cool being at Kraken is really just seeing how they've done that, but also stayed true to like the values of crypto. And I think that's something that really shines through in the Kraken brand and that, very few companies have done successfully, which is staying true to the ethos and, trying to build and grow, the technology and the products, but also keeping in mind those first principles. So if there is a commonality where, my work from CoinDesk kind of extends into what I'm doing with Kraken, it's definitely that same commitment, I would say.
I've been really impressed with some of the acquisitions that Kraken has made. I think it was in the same month. I could be wrong, but announced both the acquisition of Circle's OTC trading desk and then that they had hired you. And I was like, wow, that's here.
Well, I mean, you saw with Marco Santori yesterday, right? Who's now our chief legal officer. So I think the message is people want to work at Kraken, right? I think that again, it speaks to the brand and the commitment to the community and the ethos, right? I think that those are very strong attributes in this environment. And I think that companies that show that commitment, I mean, are reaping a lot of benefits.
Did you own revenue at CoinDesk at various points? Or was that, there was like a business office or a sales org that did that?
I never owned revenue specifically. I think that was one of the things we were trying to do is, separate the business side from the editorial to make sure that there was, never any undue influence there. I mean, I would definitely say I consulted on, matters of business and did feedback into things like that. But I think over time we were able to separate those two things. You always want some collaboration there. I did wear many hats for sure.
Let's move on to chapter 2, which is a discussion of Pete's current role at Kraken. So your official title is editor at large. Mm-hmm. And what comes with that?
Yeah, so at Kraken, I'm really working on, a diverse amount of things across product, across some different creative fields. Obviously, for exchanges, the big thing right now is to educate and acquire customers, right? So, they're doing things like research reports, which we'll talk about, webinars, they're doing evergreen content, educational content, right? There's a tremendous demand for companies in this space to help, sort of educate the market. And I think, I'm playing a role wherever Kraken needs to interface with that audience and communicate intelligently, right? So I think the thing that is really attractive about Kraken is they want to speak to new people, but they want to help guide new people in such a way where, they're getting the wisdom of the people who have come before, right? So I think that to me was very attractive in terms of, I don't think there has been a great service or an educational offering from the community. And I don't think there's a lot of companies that are really committing to that. And I think that, that's something that we're really trying to do with Kraken. As Kraken's brand right now is, we have this tremendous inner industry reputation, where people in the industry love Kraken, and we're trying to update the product and translate it in such a way where, even new people who might today take the easy choice of going to Coinbase or Cash App or Robinhood, where, you may not actually even own Bitcoin, right? Because on something like Robinhood, you may notice you can't withdraw your Bitcoin, right? You're not actually purchasing the asset. So I think, translating that kind of experience to something where you're also getting the benefits and the expertise of, the Kraken brand and the team, I think is really where, our mission is heading.
Last question about kind of the journalism space. Do you think there's anything important or different about how media businesses or journalism companies monetize in crypto versus other places? I think it's kind of interesting that the longest and probably largest in terms of page views player in the space, which is CoinDesk, monetizes with a conference. Do you think that is just a fluke, or do you think that crypto content businesses need to monetize differently?
I think the question is interesting. I've obviously spent a lot of time thinking about this over the years. I don't think there's anything unique about crypto businesses. I think that's one of the things that people get wrong maybe when looking at crypto media is that media is under tremendous change, right? If you've been following Balaji Srinivasan's tweets, he's tweeting a lot about citizen journalism and how the tools to access, media outlets. It's interesting, right? Media outlets are third parties, right? Media outlets, even the word media is that you are a medium, which means that you are, an interfacing between parties, right? So media outlets were historically intermediaries who controlled access to the means to disseminate information, right? Which was historically quite expensive, right? So if you look at the 1800s, where it was owning a printing press, or even the 1900s, right? The New York Times owned the means to print 200,000 copies of the New York Times every day and disseminate that to 70,000 New Yorkers within a few hours, right? That was the means of publication. And I find that to be something that was a really useful analogy with cryptocurrency, because if you think about it today, banks and financial institutions, they have that same sort of monopoly, right? And so printing money and putting money into financial products is a similarly resource intensive process, right? You have to print the assets. You have to make the contract. You have to have a broker sign this thing, right? It has a lot of attributes that I think it's easy to equate with earlier media. I think how I like to view cryptocurrency within a historical lens is that, what we're seeing happen with media companies, we should eventually see with financial services, that the long tail of crypto's disruptions should evolve similarly. So maybe bringing that back to crypto journalism is I think that I don't think there's anything special about cryptocurrency media, particularly. I think its media is at the long tail of being disrupted by our ability to move information at lightning speed around the world. Someday a similar thing will happen in the dissemination of money. And I think that, maybe there's a role, who knows how that will change media further, but I think it'll likely have pretty big effects.
I find it interesting how few of the publications that I've come to respect, have stayed independent, right? So like CoinDesk was acquired, the Washington Post obviously owned by Jeff Bezos. You're now at Kraken. So yeah, anyone can publish things now, but I think having the education, the background, and sort of being able to fund long, investigative pieces, that isn't cheap stuff to do. And it's part of the reasons why I pay for a subscription to the New York Times, why I pay for a subscription to the Economist.
Well, no, absolutely. Yeah. I will always defend journalism. I think that one of the issues with journalism is that I don't think journalism really knows what it is anymore. Working in media today is probably 1,000 times harder than it was 100 years ago, because it's just the tools and the competition, is so fierce. And I think that's something that you want to keep in mind when evaluating it, right? So I think technology disruption creates competition, and competition increases value. But I think at a certain point, that's not always true, right? So we still need the New York Times. We still need Reuters. We still need people who are going to pay the enormous cost of resourcing information that is in the public interest that is not public, right? So if you look at a story like, I'll give you an example that I really like, the Louis C.K. Sexual abuse or assault allegations, right? That was a story that was famously published by the New York Times, right? That's an investigation that took many months of effort, and that whose publication had massive ramifications for the entertainment industry. That kind of work still needs to be done by journalists, and that is journalism, right? I think though the journalism has been diluted by things like technology services like, Twitter and Google and the internet, right? I think it's easy to kind of prioritize clicks and publishing opinions, and these things are very easy to do, right? So I think the core of producing
price predictions.
Yeah, price predictions, right? So I think the core of producing valuable non-public information, that is a societal good, right? It's easy to understand why something like that should exist, and it's easy to understand the benefits of it. It's harder to understand how you create business models to unlock it. So I would say I'm still really passionate in that idea. I do think, though, that tech journalism particularly, and other subsets of journalism have maybe lost sight of that.
Let's transition to the role of content for businesses like Kraken, but also wallet providers. There's a whole lot of reports coming out in this space. There's a whole lot of analysis. What do you think represents value when it comes to these reports and analysis? Because everyone's taking polls, everyone's sort of compiling this stuff, and every once in a while, some of these pop. And, much like movies, a lot of these reports and analysis, it seems to be a bit of a hits-driven business, and it's kind of hard to predict. But even in industries that are hits-driven, there are companies like Disney that manage to knock it out of the park consistently and have multiple billion-dollar-plus movies in one year.
Right.
What do you think goes into a good report? What represents value to the space?
As editor at large at Kraken, I'm speaking on behalf of a lot of the people who do great behind the scenes work to ideate and develop these reports. I think the lens that we've taken on it is, to avoid kind of short-term, small window, analysis. We do some recurring monthly reports and things like that, but for our sort of larger proprietary stuff, I like to say with this report, we were able to take a vague impression and then supply hard data to sort of back that assumption up, right? So the report that we're talking about is the Great Wealth Transfer, how basically generational transition of money can give Bitcoin a price boost, right? So that takes a vague impression that people have that, generational attitudes towards Bitcoin are improving, that younger generations are more inclined to buy Bitcoin, that obviously wealth will transfer between those generations over time. And then it really takes a hard analytics approach to quantifying that, right? So we're examining authoritative sources and making reasoned estimates about how this transition might occur, right? So I think something like that can be really useful because it takes something where we're talking about a subject that's obviously, core to Kraken, which is the buying and selling of cryptocurrencies, but we're taking a much more historical or longer term lens on it and helping sort of invite new people into seeing the world through our eyes. At Kraken, really, I think where exchanges and wallets and these types of content providers can provide value is when they provide, useful frameworks, right? They avoid the easy predictions. They avoid the things that are, kind of cheap wins, and they provide something where, I like to think that the thing I like about this report is I think you could send it to someone who really hadn't interfaced with cryptocurrency a lot before, and it takes the approach of viewing it as part of technological transition at large. And there's just a ton of super interesting facts in the report, right? I think just painting this picture, right? The number of wallets that contain between 0.1 Bitcoin and 1 Bitcoin has grown. I think it was something like 200,000 in 2014 to 2 million, right? So it's easy to see something like that. And even though in crypto, being in the industry day to day, we see the ups and downs, that's a clear, multi-year trend there.
Hey, I wanted to pause for a second and let you know that this episode of the Flippening Podcast is brought to you by our friends at CryptoTrader.tax, which makes the excruciating task of reporting your cryptocurrency gains and losses a breeze. Indeed, Sorting through transaction records from your exchanges and reporting each trade in US dollar terms is not how most crypto investors want to spend a weekend. CryptoTrader.tax is a software platform that automates the entire cryptocurrency tax reporting process. It's basically like TurboTax for cryptocurrency investors. All you have to do is connect your exchanges and import your trade history into the platform. CryptoTrader.tax will do all of the number crunching and spit out your auto-filled tax reports with the click of a button. Simply give these generated tax forms to your accountant or even import them into your preferred tax filing software like TurboTax or TaxAct. You can join more than 10,000 cryptocurrency investors who are automating their crypto tax reporting with CryptoTrader.tax today. Creating an account and importing your historical data is completely free. You only pay when you want to download your tax report for the year. Just tell them that Clay from the Flippening Podcast sent you to get a discount on your tax reports. This episode is also brought to you by our longtime and trusted partner, Nexo. As someone who personally uses Nexo, I want to point out a few things that I especially like about their crypto-backed loans. First, when the price of your collateral grows, so does your credit line. Let's say that you borrow against Bitcoin when each Bitcoin is worth $5,000, but over the course of your loan, the price grows to $10,000 per Bitcoin. This means that the size of your credit line just doubled as well. I personally haven't seen anyone else doing this. A second thing that I really like about Nexo is that you only pay interest on the amount that you borrow. I've seen Nexo competitors require you to take out loans and force you to borrow the entire amount. With Nexo, you get a credit line and can borrow only the funds that you need and pay them back whenever you want with interest assessed daily. Again, this isn't something that I've seen other providers do. The final aspect of Nexo I'd like to highlight is that they give you the ability to borrow against a basket of crypto assets. For example, if you post BTC, ETH, and BNB as collateral to your Nexo account, the Nexo Oracle calculates the real-time market value of those assets and adjusts your credit line accordingly. To my knowledge, other providers in this space only allow you to borrow against one asset per loan. Finally, this episode is also brought to you by the startup that produces it, Nomics.com. Nomics is a crypto market cap website and aggregator going head-to-head with CoinMarketCap. We stand as a transparent alternative to many of the sketchy market cap websites out there. We won't name names, but I think you know who we're referring to. Anyway, if you haven't been to Nomics.com in a while, I encourage you to visit our website. We offer transparent volume statistics for nearly every cryptocurrency and crypto exchange in the space. And I believe we have the only credible crypto exchange index in the space at the time of this recording. If you're sick of scammy ads, bad design, and manipulated data provided by companies whose founders hide from public view, then check us out at nomics.com. Okay, back to Pete.
I think that's really how we've approached it, and I think we'll be seeing a few more publications coming from the Kraken Intelligence research arm coming up in Q2 and beyond.
Let's make sure we do a deep dive on the report here in a second. Before we do, can you just tell us what is the scope of everything that you cover? Is it all content? Is it you mentioned webinars, reports, copywriting? If you guys were going to run a conversion rate optimization split test of your homepage, would you be in charge of that, or who would do that?
I think one of the cool things about working at Kraken is it's definitely a roll up your sleeves environment, right? Yeah. If you want to get involved in different things, I think there's a lot of latitude there. I would say, coming from CoinDesk in that entrepreneurial environment, I've found a similar environment here where, I think that, you have a lot of different teams, a lot of different synergies. I'd like to say that I work on trying to harmonize all those things within Kraken, maybe finding a way for people who already work together to work together a little bit more efficiently, to work together in a way where they're able to kind of, align their work more with, something that interests them. What I'm hoping to bring to Kraken is just sort of that operational efficiency that you get with a 24-hour news outlet, right? Sort of, how regimented and diligent you have to be in sort of applying that to different creative functions in ways that I think make sense and that help them and us, get our messaging out.
One of the things that I appreciate about Kraken is, there are so many brands in the space that start with coin or bit, or everything is kind of very sort of jargony in terms of branding. And I like that Kraken, much like Nomics, kind of has a different name. It's a single word. And then on branding, it's sort of pink and purple. And it feels like you guys are taking branding risks. Is that true across the board? Or do you feel like you are allowed to do risky things when it comes to brand and brand voice? Or is that not owned by you?
Yeah, I definitely work with brand voice a lot. I think, I don't know if that's how I look at it, as, trying to do risky things, or that our job as, content creators is to do risky things. I think,
or to differentiate it at least.
I think it really is about whenever you're doing content, you want to accentuate what, you want to bring out the brand, right? And I think with Kraken, the key for Kraken is being really ethos aligned, community aligned, right? I think that's what separates Kraken from other exchanges, is that, Kraken is definitely, historically taking, a very ethical approach to the business, right? You can look at our CEO, Jesse Powell, and sort of the statements that he's made,
Yeah, he's great.
in terms of negotiating with the regulators and, bringing up difficult topics. I think Kraken has done a great job historically being like a Sherpa or a shepherd for the industry, right? I think when other people took easy routes on things, Kraken sometimes took the harder route because it was the right thing to do, right? And I think translating that into the brand has been really hard, right? Because it takes a lot of people to kind of commit to a set of values. I think what's cool about Kraken is we're bringing in those people, right? You saw Pierre Richard, Dan Held, myself, and Marco Santori, who's now coming in, and I think it's that commitment to values that really, is the first principle that drives everything else, that we're doing.
Okay, let's shift to chapter 3, which is about Kraken's report entitled Inheriting USDs and Acquiring BTCs, How the Great Wealth Transfer Will Fuel the Great Bitcoin Adoption. So I looked at the report and read it. It's fascinating. It kind of reminds me a little bit of the report that got me to actually buy Bitcoin back in the day. I had friends who were, mining it, but back in 2015 or so, I read a report from Tur de Meester called How to Position for the Rally in Bitcoin. It was this super optimistic report. I don't think he had a fund back then or was taking LPs, but it was the kind of thing that I think needed a refresh. But it was a good just kind of introduction to the topic. And it's hard to get that anymore because there is so much context and it's hard to know kind of where to start and who you're speaking to and all of that. So in this report, Inheriting USDs and Acquiring BTCs, How the Great Wealth Transfer Will Fuel the Great Bitcoin Adoption. Who was this written? Like if you think about kind of reader personas, was this written towards someone who's just getting started or someone else?
Yeah, so I think with working with the Kraken Intelligence team, this is something we talked about, is who's the audience. And I think the answer to that is, someone who wants to take an analytical view of what's happening within sort of the broader spectrum of technology change, right? So I think it's really easy to look at short-term windows of things. Oh, is somebody buying this stable coin, or what's going on in this market here? And it's harder to kind of take a comprehensive look at, okay, well, empirically over a large amount of time, what are we seeing, right? So even in my own personal beliefs about cryptocurrency, right, I've become a lot more of a Bitcoin advocate over time, because I think if you're really looking at the data, it's empirically clear that Bitcoin is separating itself from the other cryptocurrencies, and that, more and more the statement that Bitcoin is succeeding on its value proposition, that it is a well understood technology that is seeing adoption, is just empirically true. It's not someone's opinion. It's just looking at a great body of information. You have to sort of say that this is a statement of fact almost at this point, right? So, one of the things I liked about this report is it takes a lot of data and it sort of synthesizes it, right? So you can see that data suggests that a disproportionate amount of millennials and Gen X investors continue to be a driving force in the buying and selling of cryptocurrency, right? And if we see that continuing, well, then you can draw other assumptions about it, right? So Bitcoin is growing, it's becoming less volatile. You can say things like it's spreading, it's growing exponentially, the network is becoming more mature, right? Those are statements that you can make looking at data. The cool thing with this report is it takes those data points about the spread of Bitcoin as a technology, and it then, makes another set of assumptions about wealth transfer within the United States. And obviously, it does come to the conclusion of making somewhat of a price prediction, but, what it states is that about $68 trillion worth of wealth is going to change hands simply over time as the baby boom generation, begins to transfer wealth to younger generations. It states that at some point we can assume that the number of people who are baby boomers who have wealth is going to be zero, and it assumes that there's a rate of transfer of those assets. And then what it does is it extrapolates, well, based on the risk appetites of the people who will inherit that wealth, if they make allocations of this wealth into Bitcoin, right, if they make the consumer decision to say, I have inherited wealth, and instead of putting that wealth into equities or treasuries or the stock market or under my mattress, I'm going to choose to put some of that into Bitcoin, it extrapolates what the benefits to the network might be from a monetary perspective, right? So I think one of the things that's interesting here is if you look at, at a 5% allocation, you end up with the Bitcoin price that is pretty high. And why is that interesting? It's because, well, we're just looking at the United States. We're just looking at if people, this one specific use case. And I think it ends up drawing a really nice concrete data point where, you get all these people throwing out these big bullish cases for Bitcoin. And you're like, oh, where are these numbers coming from? I think a lay person can come into this report and they can leave sort of understanding that the long-term case for Bitcoin's price growth is positive. It's based on a lot of actual data, and that if you draw very conservative assumptions based on that data, it's still kind of an attractive investment opportunity. That, to me, I think is the real message in the report that I don't really think has been expressed quite as succinctly in any other literature out there.
Were there any surprises in this report for you? You've been in the space for a long time. It's probably hard to surprise you. Is there anything that raised your eyebrows a little bit or struck you as being counterintuitive?
I'm always surprised to see projections of Bitcoin in the future. I think as someone who was in the space early on, right? So I joined in 2013. I could have purchased my first Bitcoin at $50, but did not. I think I am someone who has lived my life being conscious that Bitcoin is a network that is growing in value. I think even then, I found it hard to accept that Bitcoin is getting more valuable, that is doing so at the rate that it is. And I think that this is generally just a very difficult thing to wrap your mind around. I think Dan Held of Kraken obviously does a good job of talking about this on Twitter. He's put a great effort out there, I think, into, distilling what the ethos of being a Bitcoin hodler is, right? So someone who is committed to Bitcoin long term, and how someone lives their life as a Bitcoin investor. And honestly, I think, Dan may get some criticism for tweets that may seem a bit like they're maybe too promotional of Bitcoin. But I think ultimately, speaking to that is valuable because I don't think that a lot of people have, I think for new people, it's difficult, right? So for people who have been in the space a long time, it's difficult for me too, right? Understanding that Bitcoin is this new type of monetary system and learning how to make decisions and choices, like personal choices, right? Because wealth is ultimately a personal choice with this system as an option. And I think that's another interesting thing about the report is I think someone could read it, understand the findings, and then maybe go forward with their life in considering Bitcoin as something that, isn't just a strange new technology. It's something that will be with them through the rest of, their investment life and financial life.
It sounds like or I would rather say the core thesis is that there's this intergenerational wealth transfer and how that is going to be a catalyst for Bitcoin adoption. Can you just dig into sort of the main thesis behind this report and unpack it a little bit more? On some level, we're asserting that number go up, but there's some mechanisms behind it. And what are those mechanisms?
As I said, the report is interesting because it's based on some foundational assumptions, right? So it assumes that over the course of time, a certain amount of known money, right? So there are basically government, agencies that sort of track this money that changes hands between generations because this money is taxed, right? So when you transition wealth, from yourself to a grandchild or something like that, when the wealth moves, it's ultimately taxed by the government, right? So ultimately we have this really great body of data for how that wealth moves. And we also know that there's a certain percentage tax allocation. So, what the report does is it takes that data and then it takes, projections for the transfer. And then it takes, again, a series of estimates for if, we were to assume that a certain amount of this wealth that is transferred to these younger, more Bitcoin-friendly generations, people with attitudes that are maybe a little bit more bullish on the long term, Bitcoin as a savings technology, as a technological tool to preserve wealth. If they allocate some amount of that wealth into Bitcoin, well, then we will see this benefit, right? So one of the kind of headlines of the report is assuming that 5% of the money that transfers is allocated at a 2% inheritance tax rate. We can expect that, just shy of $1 trillion would transfer into Bitcoin. And again, I think that's interesting because I do think it is a more conservative investment, right? People who are into cryptocurrencies tend to be quite bullish. What's interesting about it is it takes kind of this neat, reasonable assertion, right? If I was going to inherit money tomorrow, would I put 5% of into Bitcoin. As that becomes a choice that more consumers have, if some of them take it, now we're starting to get projections of, what Bitcoin looks like if it really starts succeeding at its value proposition of being a store of value over a long period of time.
So there's an interesting table, figure 17, talks about the implied price of Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
At the low end, it has it at, 67,000 per Bitcoin. At the high end, 700,000 per Bitcoin. And this is sort of speculation into, 2044. I think there's a lot of people that actually think these numbers might be low for 2044.
Well, and I think the other thing is it invites you to consider what you think will happen. By giving you a framework to make the decision, I think the report sort of avoids an easy conclusion, right? It says, do you think these assumptions are correct? And if you think these assumptions are reasonable, here's this scale for what things might look like, right? So I think it's a much more friendly framework that Kraken Intelligence has provided for newer people. It's that, you can really step into this framework and it invites you to take a little bit of a stakeholdership in, making a choice or assumption. Do I think this is accurate? Do I think, am I a person who thinks that 1% of the money that is transitioned between these generations will be stored in Bitcoin because those generations think it's a great store of value, right? Or do I think that number is higher, right? Do I think that those people are going to be, much bigger fans of Bitcoin, or they're going to use Bitcoin a lot more widely? And you can then begin sort of to draw assumptions based on how you feel about Bitcoin. And I think that's what's ultimately cool about the report is it, again, it avoids the easy conclusion. It puts a little bit of the onus on the reader to assess the framework, to walk around the framework and to ultimately get a feeling for what they think makes sense. And I think that's something that is helpful for new people, especially as they're wrapping their heads around unfamiliar concepts.
So I feel like we discovered, or we talked about the main thesis and the big ideas in the report. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about with regards to the report?
Yeah, I would say one of my favorite things about the report is just, I would actually say you mentioned figure 17. I would mention figure 1, which is, just Bitcoin within the history of technological innovations, bubbles, right? I think that people, the generations who are millennial, I'm a millennial, I'm not sure, you're a Gen X or which generation you're a part of, but I think that younger generations.
There.
Oh, yeah. I think younger generations, right? I think it's hard to contextualize for us. We came of age at a time when the internet was really peaking and it was so disruptive that it was possible for you to do things like become a Jack Dorsey who has multiple billion-dollar companies, right? At some point, the internet hit a escape velocity where it was so disruptive and it was disrupting existing industries at such a rate that you could be a serial entrepreneur, right? You could found many companies who were doing all these things. And I think with crypto, we almost have to walk back those expectations a little bit. So I think one of my favorite, charts in this kind of puts Bitcoin within, the internet mania and then sort of the roaring 20s, like auto, housing, radio, sort of the railway mania in the UK, right? I think that technology innovations is something that, it's not new, right? We have this idea that technology is anything that's new in our lifetime, but that's not necessarily true, right? I mean, radio was a technology, cars were technology, right? And these are things now that we live with and we interact with and we consider them boring, right? We consider them mature technologies. I think it's interesting considering cryptocurrencies in that way, because if they're successful, then ultimately they will display those characteristics, right? They will be like things that become so ingrained within life that they're kind of commonplace. So I really think that having that framework too, and I've done a lot of personal thinking about this, is just where do I think Bitcoin is and how do I think Bitcoin relates to other technologies? Which, comparisons do I like? And, oftentimes I find myself going back to the older comparisons because I think Bitcoin is often compared to the internet, right? But the internet is itself based on, other innovations, right? It's built on the fact that we have the ability to communicate messages electronically anyway, which is, kind of stems from the telegraph, right? Which is a much older innovation, right? So we have all these things that are built on top of each other. And I think that viewing Bitcoin in that great lineage is always helpful, right? It's helpful to put into perspective, and it can help get rid of the easy prediction and the easy comparisons that I think often come with conversations about Bitcoin.
So it sounds like this is part of Kraken's effort to be kind of the first exchange where someone buys Bitcoin, is kind of being that initial fiat on-ramp, which it looks more and more like that is something that Kraken is interested in owning or, making a dent in.
Yeah, very much so.
I know I bought my first Bitcoin on Coinbase because I didn't have to deal with order types or two-sided marketplaces or things that seemed unfamiliar to me. There was just a price and that was it. There's pros and cons of different approaches, but what has Kraken done in the last few years from a UX and just experience point of view to kind of position itself to be friendlier to that kind of consumer side first purchaser of Bitcoin with fiat?
Well, I think you're going to see a lot coming up. I can't give too much away, but I think that has been a tremendous focus of the company for the last several quarters or years. And I think, some of that work is finally going to start to come to fruition in Q2, Q3. So hopefully we'll, be able to ship a lot of things and people will really get to see how Kraken envisions the platform. I think today Kraken is definitely optimized for, your very serious crypto traders, right? You mentioned the acquisition of Circle's OTC desk. We actually acquired BitTrade, which is a Australian OTC desk, right? So growing those sort of services around the world. We acquired crypto facilities in the UK to add futures to our platform. Definitely through the acquisitions, you've seen an expansion of the services for traders who really want that sort of high-end, white glove, sort of sophisticated service. And that today is the customer that Kraken serves. I think, as I mentioned, just in my own attraction to the company, I think what's really cool is that, Kraken has that commitment to the community, commitment to the ethos, and to see that be really successful in one market and really to get the opportunity to try to translate that to something else. I think it's been super great to work on that. So, I think we're very much thinking about things like that. Obviously on the site, people come to Kraken.com today, they're going to see a product that's very much tailored to that core Kraken constituency. But I think over time it'll be interesting to see if we can make that jump to serving more, being that more of the first stop, because especially, that is an increasingly competitive environment. You're seeing, not even just Coinbase, but people like Square, right, have come into the Bitcoin buying game. You're seeing, all sorts of new services allowing people to dollar cost average into cryptocurrencies. So I think, there's certainly no shortage of competition in that sector.
Okay, let's transition to chapter 4, which is a discussion of the cryptocurrency canon, or at least what Pete thinks should be in it. Kind of thinking about reports. Are there any that stand out to you as sort of seminal reports in the space that have come out?
I would say the cryptocurrency canon is a very difficult thing to find. I've actually been thinking about this a lot lately. I don't know if it exists in a single repository. One of my favorite ones that I always cite is Jameson Lopp's Nobody Understands Bitcoin, and That's Okay. I think that's one of the ones that I had a role in editing and publishing that originally when it appeared on CoinDesk, and I think is just a really great distillation of just how to prepare your thinking. That's what a lot of, the content in the space gets wrong. I think that with an innovation, really, you have to almost prepare yourself to consider it, right? And I think a lot of people show up to cryptocurrency expecting to run a marathon without stretching. And I think that good content in the space will help you stretch, because you need to, I also compare understanding Bitcoin to a process of unlearning, right? We're so used to within our society, because as I said earlier about the technical innovations, where we're used to technical innovations being easy. We're used to like UX serving the user. I mean, so many of the social media, mobile phone revolution was all about bringing the internet closer to the end user. Here with cryptocurrency, we have the opportunity to scale technology, but we want to do that without losing the ethos, right? Like, what are the things that we're trying to preserve? I think Adam Back does a really fantastic job of, in his articulations and defenses of Bitcoin over the years of, we need to scale up the ethos, right? Because if we want scale at any cost, right, it's like we already have PayPal, right? We have PayPal and these services for digital money movement, right? So I think that the really great work in the space has been people who have almost cleared the brush in terms of, helping people understand how to think about Bitcoin. So definitely, Nobody Understands Bitcoin, and That's Okay by Jameson Lopp is a favorite of mine. Definitely writings of Adam Back, I think, are pretty seminal also. It's a tough space to wrap your head around. Even after being here for so long, I feel like I learn something new every day. So
3 is a very satisfying number. Is there a third one? The writings of Adam Back, Nobody Understands Bitcoin, Is That Okay? Is there a third you can get me here? Or is that would you need to be a little bit more prepared for that?
I could tell you one that I wish somebody would write. Maybe that's an interesting one.
Sure, let's do that.
I think one of the fascinating debates right now is around mining, which I think Bitcoin's use of the proof of work algorithm to disseminate rewards is a really fascinating element of the Bitcoin protocol that even 10 years on is not very well understood. And I think what's pretty interesting is that we've seen over the last 3 or 4 years is honestly with the ICO boom, we've seen an aggressive capitalization in alternatives to that. And I think what we're going to end up coming around to is a reappreciation or a higher level understanding of what Bitcoin mining is. So I think one of the fascinating debates that I would love to see a definitive article on is the understanding of the Bitcoin mining market and security model. Basically, because every time we get to one of these halvings, I think there's people who want to ring the alarm that, Bitcoin, all these miners will go offline. Bitcoin, could fail, right? There's this mining death spiral sort of argument that always comes up. And we're not seeing that, right? So I think really someone who could do a definitive article on understanding and explaining Bitcoin's mining market in a really sophisticated way.
Hey, this is Clay cutting in from the editor's booth to note that anyone interested in learning about Bitcoin mining, the incentives behind it, or mining-related security should check out Flippening episode 71 with Hasu entitled Economics of Proof of Work Mining. We cover everything from Nakamoto consensus to the problem of declining block rewards. Find it at flippening.com/Hasu, spelled Hasu. Okay, back to Pete.
I give you my recent spitball, which I think that Bitcoin is the reason we in Bitcoin do not really care about mining profitability is because miners are not continuing the Bitcoin service. The right way to think about Bitcoin mining is that Bitcoin is paying for computation and that the market is serving Bitcoin's demand for computation. So it is immaterial how that demand is satisfied. What is material is that Bitcoin creates the condition under which that demand must be satisfied because every 10 blocks, Bitcoin needs to accumulate enough computation to have added a block to its blockchain. And it is Bitcoin's continued demand for the service of blocks and economic value that the network actually provides towards extracting that from the world that seems to be the secret sauce of proof of work. And I think that there's been a lot of focus over the years on the Bitcoin mining industry as something that's important to Bitcoin, but maybe we really haven't quite articulated what that relationship is. And I don't even know if I've done a good job of it right now.
It's a fascinating discussion. I think you've provided some valuable insight there. Who do you think are some underamplified voices that you think have unique perspectives and are folks that are maybe challenging long-held opinions or at least, shaking up the space in a way that's helpful when it comes to writing in essays? Where does your mind go?
And I think writers oftentimes bias towards skepticism, which is something that I've also, over the last few years, struggled with a little bit personally, is that writers always seem to over-bias being critical, right? That's something that sort of writers hold up in esteem, right? To give a really critical comment, right? Is it's almost like you feel like as a writer that you're doing some great, amazing thing, right? So it's funny, one of my articles that I got the most hate for was a very positive article I did about finance that I think a lot of people attacked because it was so positive. But I think that people in the space, there is sort of an over-indexing of being critical. And I always question that because I think that research reports and research writers and journalists, being critical doesn't necessarily mean you're providing a ton of value. It's one of two modes, which is you can also just point out that something is going really well, right? And I think that, some recent work that I've been really interested in, I think Tim Copeland at Decrypt did a fantastic report on the privacy issues with .eth domains. I thought was really fascinating, really good example of, where cryptocurrency journalism can be impactful, right? Sort of taking this interesting novelty technology, which is the ability to kind of tokenize easy wallet addresses and then showcasing that you can kind of extract, all these pieces of information about people who are using them. I thought that was super fascinating. Obviously you have to tip your hat to anybody who's doing great investigative work, like, the Block, with their, breaking the story last week about CoinMarketCap being acquired by Binance, pretty foundational work for the space there. I think I mentioned in our conversation, somebody who's in the crypto world, but is venturing outside a bit is Ben Munster, who was with Decrypt for a while, has been doing some great coverage of the coronavirus from Italy. Just got some funny Esquire articles from there. But yeah, I mean, I think that those are some of the names that are top of mind for me recently.
As far as crypto content OGs, I think you're as OG as they come. You've had an arc of a career here, and it's far from being over. You mentioned you were a millennial. You know, when you think about legacy and the impact you'd like to have, 10, 20 years out, what do you see there? What do you want to look back and see yourself as having accomplished far into the future?
I think this speaks to my transition from journalism towards what I'm doing with Kraken now. Is I think I'd like to be seen as someone who contributed positively to the movement. And I think I was able to do that at CoinDesk because I think, as I said, at that stage in the development of the technology, I think it was really critical that something like CoinDesk exist and that it be managed by someone who could provide the critical lens that was needed, right? If you think of all the things that, we saw in such a short amount of time, there was the skepticism for the private blockchain trend. There was, the sudden, emergence of ICOs and the, Bitcoin scaling debate. And I think the CoinDesk record on that stuff was ultimately pretty good. And I think that the way that we covered that stuff, I did think helped, further the technology. I think, not to quote somebody, but I think Joseph Poon, the co-creator of Lightning Network, once told me is that he thinks that because CoinDesk was around back then, many people who would have scammed ICOs, just ceased to exist because we were providing coverage. And I think, I don't know if I ever believed that comment from him, but I do think that it is probably the most flattering piece of commentary I've gotten. I think I would like to be seen as someone who is still contributing there, right? We found many ways to contribute to that. I think that, but I do think that, people who have been around in the industry, we do need to do our work to grow it, right? I think that is something that I'm increasingly interested in, and doing so responsibly and in ways that still serve people, I think is hopefully going to be a commonality in the work. So
that's very cool. Do you have time for one more?
We can do one more, sure.
Kind of thinking about Kraken a little bit and a lot of the challenges that crypto exchanges face when it comes to products and user experience and sort of what to prioritize and what not to when it comes to product roadmap. It strikes me that there's very much this kind of vertical versus horizontal sort of tug of war that can happen in this space. For example, someone could go all in on Bitcoin, offer Bitcoin loans, Lightning Network transactions, be the very first to implement SegWit and just decide that, hey, we're going to be a Bitcoin exchange and really embrace all the things you can do on top of that. Then, of course, there's exchanges that are very Ethereum oriented and have embraced DeFi, which has really come out of, I don't want to say out of nowhere, but it's just really impressive what's happening there and the developer community that's really developed around that. There's just such a critical mass of smart people working on products there. And then you've got all the other things. You've got Tezos staking and stuff you can do with Tron. And then there's a whole bunch of people that'll just sort of sign up for whatever exchange lists the latest ICO or sort of new token or asset that they're interested in acquiring. You've got folks like, FTX making all kinds of tokenized financial products with various mechanisms built in. There's just so many different ways to go. Does Kraken or do you have sort of an opinion on whether or not it's best to be sort of mostly horizontal or mostly vertical, an idea, a philosophy about the trade-offs between both of those approaches?
Yeah, I think I would answer that. I would just say that I think our CEO, Jesse Powell, has done a really great job of setting the tone for that. I think that, one of the benefits you get of being a company with scale is that, you're not under as much pressure to innovate. But I think Kraken has done a good job of expanding its services, right? So we did Tezos staking recently. I think we were one of the more competitive people in terms of our staking return rate, right? I think it's all about, as a company, and putting your foot into different things and finding clever ways to expand it. But again, as being a, large company, like one of the benefits is you get to see how other people fare with these things, right? You get to benefit from the great experimentation that goes on and, you can borrow the good ideas and you can let the ones that are a bit more overzealous are going to play their course. So, I think we're definitely watching and analyzing, and there are great, vibrant discussions internally about a lot of these things. That said, are you going to see, huge markets for decentralized lending capabilities on Kraken tomorrow? I think the answer to that is probably no, right? I think that we're going to move at the measured pace that I think Kraken, and I think this has been a major takeaway since I got here, is just, security is the overriding first principle of Kraken. And if there is anything that in even any way would make our security even a tiny fraction more compromised or not, or even vulnerable, I should say, is probably a better term, it will not happen. And that, I think, honestly, as someone who was from outside the exchange sphere and came into it, I think people should take a lot of comfort in that, right? I think Kraken is a company that takes great pride in its choices, thinks about things pretty deeply, and ultimately when it does something in the market, I think that sends a signal that, it is something that the company has thought strategically about. I wouldn't say that we're quite making an endorsement, but, I think people should view our decisions as coming from that sort of measured and, carefully weighed lens. And I think that, it's been really great to see up close, and, hoping to see a lot more of that.
That concludes my conversation with Pete Rizzo, editor-at-large at Kraken. I hope you enjoyed it. Before you go, I want to invite you to subscribe to our fully customizable daily crypto newsletter. It's the first of its kind in the industry. You choose the delivery time for when you want to get the newsletter and the cryptocurrencies that you want price updates and news updates on. And we ship you tailored pricing data and market news 7 days a week. It's a great way to cut through the noise and drill down to the crypto market info that matters most to you. It's the first of its kind. It's pretty cool. I really enjoy getting this newsletter myself. Of course, I'm biased, but to subscribe, go to news.nomics.com. Again, that's news.nomics.com, spelled Nomics. Okay, that's it for this week. Stay tuned for next week's episode. Until then, take care. Bye. That's it for this week. To sign up for our free crypto investing newsletter, listen to other episodes, or get the show notes from this episode, please visit flippening.com. I also invite you to check out the startup that funds this podcast, Nomics, spelled Nomics, at nomics.com. Finally, if you got value from the show, the biggest thing you can do to help us out is to leave a 5-star review with some comments and feedback on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.